In the fall of 1856, just outside the quiet farmlands of Medina County, Ohio, a discovery was made so disturbing that local newspapers refused to print the full details for almost 30 years. Buried under the Grimsby home for displaced children were 23 small, unmarked graves. 23 children who were supposed to have been sent west to live with new families, children whose names had been erased from every official record. What the authorities uncovered would destroy the reputation of one of the most respected families in the county, and force the community to face a terrifying truth: sometimes the greatest evil hides behind the brightest halo. Before we begin, if you're drawn to the dark and hidden corners of American history, hit subscribe, tap that bell icon, and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from, because stories like this have happened in small towns all across our nation. The setting: Medina County in 1856 wasn't the sort of place where you expected horror. It was farmland, thick forests, and dirt roads. Only about 8,000 people lived there, scattered across small farming settlements. Winters were brutal, and the land was hard to work. People clung to their churches, their families, and to the idea that neighbors could be trusted. 3 miles from the county courthouse, down a narrow dirt road lined with oak and maple trees, stood the Grimsby Home for Displaced Children. Founded in 1851 by Jeremiah and Martha Grimsby, it had the reputation of being the most charitable, most Christian orphanage in the region. Jeremiah was tall, stern, with cold gray eyes and hair that had gone white far too young. His wife, Martha, was small, quiet, and always looked nervous, but locals said she had a heart for children. Their adult son, Caleb, helped run the home. At 28, Caleb had his father's height but none of his mother's softness. He watched people with pale blue eyes that seemed to measure and judge everything. The reputation: from the outside, the Grimsby operation looked perfect. They took in the children no one else wanted, those with physical deformities, those considered difficult or damaged, and those who had already been rejected by other orphanages. They accepted kids from across Ohio and even from out of state, survivors of cholera outbreaks, fires, and families destroyed by poverty. Inspectors praised the Grimsbys year after year. Methodist donors gave generously. The state sent regular funding for food, clothing, and schooling. And when children left, the story was always the same: they'd been placed with loving families heading west. But locals noticed something strange. They never saw the children playing outside. No laughter, no games, no singing from the windows. When asked, Jeremiah always had the same answer: discipline and respect came first. Most people accepted that. It was easier than asking more questions. The outsider. In September 1856, an outsider came to town, a traveling photographer named Edmund Hartwell. He'd been hired by the Ohio Department of Public Welfare to take pictures of schools, poorhouses, and orphanages for a statewide report. Hartwell had already visited dozens of institutions. The Grimsby home was just another name on his list. The man driving Hartwell's wagon, a local named Tom Bradshaw, admitted something odd on the way. "I've lived here 15 years, he said, and I've never seen a single child outside that place. Not once." First impressions. The orphanage wasn't welcoming. A 3-story gray building with narrow windows, it looked more like a prison than a home. Behind it was a smaller building, connected by a covered walkway. The yard was bare: no swings, no toys, no sign of children at all. Jeremiah met them at the door, tall and blocking the entrance. "We weren't expecting any official visits," he said flatly. "The children are in lessons. I don't like them being disturbed." Hartwell handed over a letter from the state, explaining this was a routine inspection. Still, Jeremiah argued for 20 minutes before finally agreeing, under strict rules. Hartwell could photograph the dining hall and classroom, but only when they were empty. No speaking to the children. And Caleb would escort him everywhere. Our children have been through terrible traumas, Jeremiah explained. Unexpected encounters with strangers can cause episodes. Inside the house. The moment Hartwell stepped inside, he noticed the smell. Pine oil, and something else he couldn't place, something faintly rotten. The walls were bare. No drawings, no decorations. The halls were long, narrow, and lined with heavy wooden doors that had no windows. Caleb led him to the second-floor classroom. 30 desks, perfectly aligned, each with a slate and chalk. No books, no papers, no personal belongings. Where are their things? Hartwell asked. Personal items cause fighting, Caleb said. We give them only what they need, when they need it. While setting up his camera, Hartwell heard faint noises, moaning, coughing, and soft crying, from somewhere deeper in the building. Some of our residents are sick, Caleb said quickly. We have an infirmary. The dining hall. Downstairs, the dining hall was just as sterile, long wooden tables, benches, and a serving counter with huge iron pots. It felt like a military mess hall, not a place for children. Hartwell began to wonder if the rumors about the Grimsbys, the ones whispered in town, might hold some truth after all. But what he didn't know was that this visit would set off a chain of events that, within weeks, would lead authorities to dig beneath the Grimsby home, and uncover something the community would not speak of for a generation. To be continued. Part 2. The message beneath the table. Hook. When photographer Edmund Hartwell visited the Grimsby home for displaced children in 1856, he thought he was there to take routine inspection photos. But in the quiet, empty dining hall, he found something scratched into the wood, that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was just 2 words. 2 words that turned his stomach cold. Help us. What he didn't know yet was that this wasn't just a cry for help. It was a warning, and it was already too late for most of the children. The carving. The discovery happened by accident. Hartwell had been adjusting his camera when a lens cap slipped from his fingers and rolled under one of the long tables. When he reached for it, his hand brushed over something rough carved into the bench. In the dim afternoon light, he leaned closer and read the jagged letters, scratched deep into the wood, as if made with a nail or a sharp stone. Help US. He froze, staring at the words. In that moment, the silence of the building felt heavier than ever. No sound of dishes clattering, no voices, no footsteps. Just the faint ticking of his own pocket watch. Hartwell didn't mention what he'd found. He finished his work as calmly as possible, packed up his equipment, and left. But the words burned themselves into his mind. Back in Cincinnati, it took 3 weeks before Hartwell could act on his suspicions. Back in Cincinnati, he was swamped with developing photographs and preparing his official report. But the Grimsby home wouldn't leave his thoughts. The carved plea for help. The unnatural quiet. The way Jeremiah and Caleb had controlled every step of his visit. So he started asking questions, carefully. Asking around. Hartwell reached out to other photographers who had visited orphanages across Ohio. Every single one described the same thing. Noisy, bustling institutions. Children playing, talking, laughing. Artwork on the walls. Teachers eager to show their progress. No one had ever experienced an orphanage as silent as the Grimsby home. A troubling conversation. Through his contacts, Hartwell arranged lunch with Samuel Hutchins, a clerk at the Ohio Department of Public Welfare. Hutchins had overseen inspection paperwork for the Grimsby home for years. The thing about the Grimsbys, Hutchins said, stirring his coffee, is they never have problems. No sickness, no discipline issues, no extra funding requests. Always spotless, always perfect. Too perfect. Hartwell leaned in. And the children? Hutchins lowered his voice. I've never seen the same child twice. Every year, when I ask about specific names, they tell me the same thing. Transferred out west, sent to relatives, placed with farming families. But they never give details. The records don't add up. Hartwell began digging into the official transfer logs. On paper, the Grimsbys had placed 127 children into new homes over the past 5 years. An incredible success rate, if it were real. But there was a problem. Every single placement was supposedly with farming families in Western territories. No exact towns, no addresses, and not a single follow-up letter from any child or adoptive parent. In other orphanages, this would have been unheard of. Families wrote back, children sent drawings, records were kept, but with the Grimsbys, nothing. Searching the West, Hartwell tried another angle. In Cincinnati's taverns, he spoke to merchants, teamsters, and travelers who had worked the western routes. Some had transported children from other institutions. None had ever heard of children coming from the Grimsby home. The photograph. Then came the moment that made his blood run cold. While reviewing his negatives in the darkroom, Hartwell spotted something he hadn't noticed before. In one dining hall photo, near the far window, a pale shape was pressed against the glass. It was a face, a small child's face, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. The grainy image couldn't hide the terror in those eyes. Hartwell stared at the picture for a long time before setting it aside. He had seen enough to know he needed to go back to Medina County. When Hartwell returned to Medina County, he didn't head straight for the Grimsby home. Instead, he stayed in the county seat and quietly questioned locals. Some people were hesitant to speak. Others acted as though there was nothing unusual about the orphanage. But then he met Sarah Kellerman, who ran the general store. She leaned across the counter and lowered her voice. "They don't shop here," she said. "Not for the children, anyway. Never buy toys, never buy clothes in small sizes. When they buy food, it's only adult portions. And the lime, they buy more lime than any farm could use. Always have it delivered straight to their property. Never pick it up themselves." Lime. Hartwell knew its uses. It could neutralize odors. It could also help conceal decomposition. The doctor's statement. The county doctor, Marcus Tilton, confirmed more of Hartwell's fears. In 10 years of practice, the doctor said, "I've treated children from every farm, school, and home in this county, except that one. According to the Grimsbys, every child there is in perfect health. No flu, no broken bones, no measles. Nothing. That's not just unusual, it's impossible." The stakeout. By mid-November, Hartwell decided to see for himself. He borrowed a pair of field glasses from a Union Army contact and took up position in a grove of trees 200 yards from the orphanage. For 3 days, he watched the property. He expected to see some sign of children, morning activity, laundry hanging to dry, movement at the windows. But there was nothing. The grounds were still, the windows dark, the doors rarely opening except for Caleb or Jeremiah stepping out briefly before disappearing inside again. On the third night, as the wind rattled the branches above him, Hartwell realized he hadn't seen a single child the entire time. Not one. To be continued. Part 3. Hartwell's first days of observation yielded no signs of normal life at the Grimsby orphanage. Despite the presence of 30 or more supposed residents, no laundry ever hung on the lines. No smoke curled from kitchen chimneys. No bustle of meal preparation or clatter of dishes echoed from the main building. And, most unsettling of all, no children were ever seen outdoors in daylight. Only one regular activity broke the stillness, and it chilled Hartwell more with each passing evening. Just after sunset, Caleb Grimsby would emerge from the main building carrying bundles wrapped in burlap or heavy canvas. Their sizes varied, but many were disturbingly small. Caleb loaded them onto a handcart and wheeled them toward the staff quarters, disappearing into the dense forest at the property's rear. On his third night, Hartwell saw something that ended any pretense of detached observation. Around midnight, lanterns or torches flared in the woods where Caleb made his nightly trips. The lights moved in a methodical, almost military pattern, too organized for casual night work. For nearly 2 hours, the darkness pulsed with the rhythm of tools striking earth, the scrape of shovels, and voices, urgent but too far away to distinguish words. Hartwell's attempt to alert Sheriff William Bradenton met with resistance. Bradenton, more accustomed to mediating tax disputes than criminal cases, dismissed the matter as a city man's overactive imagination. "The Grimsbys have cared for orphans for years without complaint," he said flatly. But Hartwell persisted, showing photographs, transcripts of local whispers, and his own meticulous notes. Even then, Bradenton's change of heart was reluctant. Hartwell soon learned why. 3 years earlier, Jeremiah Grimsby had chaired the county committee that recommended Bradenton for his post. Jeremiah's influence reached far. He sat on the boards of 3 Methodist churches, donated generously to political campaigns, and corresponded with state legislators on child welfare. His wife, Martha, was active in women's charities and spoke eloquently about the family's devotion to vulnerable children. Inspectors praised the Grimsby home as a model of Ohio's progressive reforms, and politicians touted its placement, success rate, in speeches. Any scandal would stain not just the Grimsbys, but every official who had supported them. Bradenton's compromise was to conduct a thorough but discreet inspection. He and Hartwell would visit unannounced, under the guise of routine county business. Hartwell's camera would serve as an excuse for documenting any irregularities. They arrived on a gray December morning under lowering clouds that threatened snow. The reception was telling. Jeremiah, normally confident, stammered through explanations for the orphanage's eerie quiet. Martha vanished after a brief greeting, muttering about urgent kitchen duties. Caleb's barely contained hostility simmered close to the surface, his hands shook, and his replies to simple questions were erratic, almost confrontational. When Bradenton remarked on the absence of children, Caleb delivered a rehearsed speech about a day of silent reflection, supposedly inspired by Quaker traditions. Bradenton, now visibly uneasy, demanded to see the children. After a whispered conference between the 3 Grimsbys, the visitors were escorted upstairs to a large classroom. About 20 children sat perfectly still at individual desks. None met their eyes. When Bradenton asked names and simple questions, answers came as faint whispers, stilted, as if memorized. Hartwell noted hollow cheeks, pale skin, and listless movements, clear signs of malnutrition. Several bore injuries, bandaged arms, healing cuts, even bruises shaped like fingers around one girl's throat. When he raised his camera, Jeremiah blocked him, claiming the children were too traumatized for photographs. A boy of about 10, seated in the back row, met Hartwell's gaze with desperate hope. Slowly, he began to raise his hand, then froze as Caleb stepped behind his chair. The boy lowered his hand and stared at his desk, trembling. As they left, Hartwell devised a pretext to return. He forgot his lens cloth in the classroom. When he returned an hour later, Jeremiah and Caleb were gone. Martha answered the door, her composure shattered. Her hands shook, her words tumbled out in broken fragments. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. Jeremiah said we were helping them, ending their suffering. But then it became something else. The sound of horses on the road silenced her. She retrieved the cloth and retreated into her usual guarded silence before her husband and son reappeared. The implication that children were being killed, not cared for, pushed Bradenton to seek state assistance. But politics slowed everything. Hartwell, convinced children were in immediate danger, argued against waiting. On December 15, 1856, his worst fears were confirmed. Watching from concealment, he saw Caleb carry what could only be a child's body, small, limp, wrapped in canvas, onto the cart and trundle it toward the woods. The raid came before dawn on December 18. Bradenton, armed with hastily obtained warrants and 3 deputies borrowed from neighboring counties, approached under lifting morning fog. The timing was deliberate, early enough to prevent destruction of evidence, late enough to avoid accusations of midnight assault on a prominent family. The orphanage grounds were unnervingly still. No roosters, no smoke, no human voices. Even the winter birds avoided the place. Fresh wagon tracks led from the house toward the forest, the ruts deep as if from a heavy load. Dark stains dotted the snow, later confirmed as human blood by Dr. Tilton. Through the parlor window, Jeremiah was seen frantically burning papers. When Deputy Marshal Connolly pounded on the door, the Grimsby patriarch glanced up, face blanching, then fed another sheaf into the flames. The confrontation was about to begin. If you'd like, I can carry this right through the raid itself so part 3 ends on the actual discovery scene. That would keep the pacing tight and push the suspense into part 4. Do you want me to extend it that far? Part 4. The front door of the Grimsby orphanage swung open with a reluctant groan. Jeremiah stood framed in the doorway, his eyes darting between the deputies, rifles and Bradenton's expressionless face. "This is an outrage," he said, voice steady but too rehearsed. "We've done nothing wrong. Step aside, Jeremiah," Bradenton ordered. "We have warrants." For a moment, Hartwell thought the patriarch might slam the door. But Jeremiah read the deputies' stances correctly, 3 men from outside his influence, less concerned with politics than with orders. He moved aside, stiff with dignity, and motioned them in. The parlor reeked of scorched paper. The grate was choked with ash, still glowing faintly, evidence of recent burning. Hartwell, ignoring Jeremiah's protests, reached into the hearth with the fire tongs and pulled out a partially charred ledger. Several pages were gone entirely, others were scorched but legible. The surviving entries were chilling. Dates, names, ages, notations like relocated, sent east, and, most disturbingly, released. Some names had a crude X beside them. Caleb entered from the rear hall, wiping something dark from his hands with a rag. He stopped short when he saw the deputies, his face hardening into defiance. "What's this about?" he demanded. "You'll find out soon enough," Bradenton said, motioning for one deputy to keep him in view. They moved through the house, searching room by room. The children's quarters upstairs were worse than Hartwell imagined. Iron cots lined the walls, their thin mattresses soiled and threadbare. The air was heavy with sickness, a mix of unwashed bodies, damp wood, and something coppery beneath it all. Half the beds were empty. The 20 children they had seen days earlier were nowhere in sight. A locked door at the end of the hall drew immediate attention. Caleb, under orders, produced a key with obvious reluctance. The hinges shrieked as the door swung inward. Inside, a storeroom held more than cleaning supplies. Against one wall, wooden crates were stacked too high. They were marked with destinations: Cleveland, Columbus, even New York. Bradenton pried open the nearest with the butt of his rifle. It was not food or blankets inside, but children's clothing, neatly folded, tagged with names and dates. Many of the garments were stained. Hartwell's stomach turned. He picked up a small shoe, its sole still bearing traces of dried mud. The leather was scuffed as if from frantic running. "Where are they?" Bradenton asked, his voice low but lethal. Jeremiah spread his hands. "Many were adopted. Some sent to other homes. We keep their belongings until we know they've settled." The explanation rang hollow. The ledger's dates showed releases, in the dead of winter, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single night, always coinciding with the torches Hartwell had seen in the woods. They moved to the kitchen. Large iron pots simmered on the stove, but the smell was wrong, meaty, metallic. Hartwell's hand trembled as he lifted a lid. What floated there made him stagger back. "Don't," Bradenton muttered, seeing his face. One deputy vomited into the hearth. From the cellar came a noise, muffled, irregular, almost like breathing through cloth. Lanterns in hand, they descended the narrow stairs. The air grew colder, wetter. The stone walls glistened with condensation, and the floor was packed dirt. In the far corner, behind a stack of barrels, they found a small wooden door no higher than Hartwell's waist. It was bolted from the outside. Bradenton drew back the bolt. The door opened into a cramped chamber barely tall enough to crouch in. Inside were 6 children, their eyes wide and skin ghostly pale. They shrank from the lantern light. A girl of about 12 whispered, "Don't let him take us back." "Back where?" Hartwell asked gently. She pointed toward the woods. The deputies carried the children upstairs while Hartwell and Bradenton pressed for answers. But the Grimsbys had retreated into silence. Caleb stared at the floor, jaw clenched. Jeremiah spoke only to claim legal counsel. Martha kept wringing her hands and muttering fragments of prayer. Bradenton made the decision. "We're searching the woods now." Snow began to fall as they followed the cart tracks into the forest. The air was so still that every breath sounded loud. After half a mile, the path narrowed, hemmed in by skeletal trees. They came to a clearing ringed with crude wooden posts. Freshly turned earth marked several spots, too small for adult graves. The deputies began digging. The first discovery froze everyone in place. Beneath barely a foot of soil lay a small bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside was the body of a boy, perhaps 8 years old, his features shrunken by cold but unmistakably human. His wrists bore rope marks. One deputy crossed himself, another cursed under his breath. By the time the digging stopped, they had uncovered 9 bodies, some skeletal, others recent enough to draw scavengers. Each was wrapped, tagged, and buried with disturbing precision, as if catalogued. Hartwell's hands shook so violently he could barely focus his camera. The click of the shutter felt like a sin, yet he knew every frame was necessary. Back at the orphanage, the Grimsbys were arrested without ceremony. Jeremiah's mask of dignity had crumbled, replaced by something like contempt for the men who dared touch him. Caleb fought violently, earning a blow to the head from a deputy's rifle butt. Martha wept silently, offering no resistance. The rescued children were taken to the nearest town for medical care. Many were too weak to speak. Others, in fevered whispers, spoke of night journeys into the woods, of the pit, of others who never came back. Hartwell's report would later describe the events of that day as a glimpse into deliberate cruelty masked by piety. But as the wagons rolled away toward the county jail, Hartwell couldn't shake the feeling that they had only uncovered part of the truth. In the half-burned ledger, one entry stood apart from the rest. It bore no name, only a symbol, crudely drawn in ink. It matched the carving Hartwell had once seen on a tree at the forest's edge, where no one from the orphanage was supposed to go. And beside it, in cramped handwriting, was a date, December 22, 1856. 4 days away. If you want, I can make part 5 dive into what that symbol means, the December 22nd event, and how it connects to something far older than the Grimsbys. That's where the story can escalate beyond just a crime into something darker. Do you want me to move straight into that? Part 5: The Unseen Hallways. The decision to return to the Grimsby property had been building in Hartwell for weeks. The scraps of information he had gathered from townsfolk, the peculiar absence of children in daily activities, the unnerving image of that terrified face pressed to the dining hall window, all of it had left him with a sense of unfinished business. The time for cautious questions was over. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to go inside again. On a moonless night in early December, Hartwell made his move. The air was brittle with cold, each breath blooming in small white clouds that quickly vanished into the dark. He approached the property from the rear, taking care to keep to the tree line. In the distance, the orphanage loomed like a fortress, its dark windows reflecting faint starlight, its walls as silent as a mausoleum. A single lantern burned in an upstairs room, casting a narrow yellow beam onto the frost-covered lawn below. Hartwell carried only what he could conceal: a small oil lamp with a hooded shade, his camera, a leather-bound notebook, and the revolver he had begun keeping at his side since the investigation turned ominous. His plan was simple in concept and treacherous in execution: enter quietly, document everything he could, and leave before dawn. The back door was locked, but the wood was old and the latch simple. With a bit of pressure from his penknife, the mechanism gave way. The hinges let out a soft groan as he eased the door inward, stepping into a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of lime and damp stone. The air inside was warmer than he expected, but carried with it a strange, metallic tang, like rust mixed with smoke. He paused, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no distant laughter. Just the low hum of silence pressing against his eardrums. The first room he entered appeared to be a storage area: wooden shelves lined with sacks of flour, barrels of salted meat, crates marked with destinations in distant states. The sight might have been unremarkable, if not for one detail: nearly every barrel was stamped with the same shipping mark, H. and Sons Freight, Kansas Territory. The same vague Western placement that had plagued the official records. Hartwell moved deeper into the building, his lamp's beam illuminating a series of identical corridors. The walls were painted a dull gray, the floors scrubbed clean to the point of sterility. Here and there, a faded portrait hung crookedly, stern-faced benefactors and clergymen, their eyes seeming to follow him. It was only when he reached the eastern wing that the building's silence began to feel unnatural. The hallway here was lined with closed doors, each bearing a small brass number plate. The air was cooler, heavier. Hartwell chose one at random, room 12, and gently turned the handle. The hinges resisted, as if the door had not been opened in some time. Inside was a small, bare chamber containing nothing but a narrow bed with an iron frame, a stool, and a single blanket folded with military precision. No toys, no books, no drawings pinned to the wall. The air was stale, as if the window had not been opened in months. Hartwell inspected 3 more rooms, finding them identical in their emptiness. It was as though the space had been prepared for children who never came, or for children who never stayed. Then, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible. It came from somewhere beyond the east wing, an irregular tapping, like fingernails against wood. Hartwell froze, straining to pinpoint the source. Slowly, he followed it down the hall to a narrow door at the far end. This one was different. No brass number, just plain wood with a tarnished handle. The door was locked. Hartwell knelt, using the same method he'd used on the rear entrance. It took longer this time. The lock was newer, heavier. When it finally clicked open, he slipped inside and immediately understood why it had been kept secured. The room beyond was not a bedroom at all, but a stairwell descending into the earth. The air here was damp and colder still, carrying with it the unmistakable odor of mildew, and something else, something sour and organic that made his stomach clench. The tapping sound was louder now, but still maddeningly distant. Lamp in hand, Hartwell descended the steps, each one creaking under his weight. The walls narrowed, and the faint plaster gave way to rough stone. At the bottom, the passage opened into a wide underground corridor lit by a single oil lamp set in an iron bracket. The floor here was different, packed dirt, uneven and damp in places. Along the corridor's length were heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands. From behind one, he thought he heard the sound again, this time more urgent. Hartwell stepped closer, pressing his ear to the wood. "Hello," he whispered. There was a pause. Then, a small, trembling voice answered. "Please, don't leave." Hartwell's blood ran cold. He glanced down the corridor. 6 doors on one side, 5 on the other, all shut tight. The tapping began again, now joined by muffled voices, thin and fragile, like the sound of wind passing through reeds. He tried the latch. Locked. His hands shook as he worked the mechanism with his penknife, but before he could free it, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell above. Someone was coming. Hartwell extinguished his lamp, plunging the corridor into darkness. He pressed himself into the shadow of the wall, heart pounding in his ears. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint swish of fabric. A figure descended into view, a tall man in a black coat, holding a lantern that cast long, swinging shadows. His face was sharp and angular, his eyes scanning the corridor. The man paused at the third door on the left, producing a key from his pocket. He unlocked it, opened it just enough to slip inside, and shut it again with a dull thud. Hartwell couldn't see what was within, but he caught the faint whimper of a child before the door closed completely. The urge to act was overwhelming, but so was the danger. Alone, unarmed beyond his revolver, and with no way to spirit away the children without help, Hartwell forced himself to retreat. He retraced his steps up the stairs, back through the east wing, and out the rear door into the freezing night air. By the time he reached the safety of the woods, his mind was already racing with the next step. He needed allies. People who would believe him. People who could help expose the truth before the Grimsbys silenced every witness, including him. Somewhere in the cold darkness behind him, a child's voice still echoed in his ears. "Please, don't leave. If you'd like, I can go straight into part 6 so we can keep the tension building toward the climax." Part 6, the night they opened the ground. The wind that night carried a strange weight, thick with the smell of wet earth and something older, something that seemed to rise from the very bones of the land. Hartwell had returned to the grove for his second night of surveillance, determined to witness something, anything, that would give him proof of the Grimsby home's true purpose. He had chosen a vantage point farther to the west this time, where a cluster of blackened oaks leaned together like conspirators. The moon was waning, casting only a pale, broken light across the fields. The house itself sat silent, windows dark, its stone facade swallowing what little light there was. No movement, no children's laughter, not even the flicker of a lamplight. But at a little past midnight, the stillness broke. A single lantern bobbed into view along the path from the main house to the rear fields. Behind it came 3 figures, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in heavy coats. Their faces were obscured by the dark, but their gait was purposeful. They carried shovels. Hartwell's first thought was that they were burying something, a late-night chore perhaps, a farm necessity. But then he saw what followed them. 4 more figures, each dragging something long and covered in canvas. The shapes beneath the fabric were rigid. Too rigid. The way they caught on the uneven ground suggested something solid and heavy, like bodies. Hartwell's chest tightened. The group made their way to a patch of earth at the farthest edge of the property, a place Hartwell hadn't been able to see on his previous visit. There, in a shallow hollow surrounded by sparse grass, they began to dig. The sound carried to him in the cold air, the dull, rhythmic scrape of metal against soil. For nearly 20 minutes they worked, switching positions, the lantern casting grotesque shadows on their faces. Every so often, one of them would pause, glancing toward the house as if ensuring no one was watching. When the hole was deep enough, they lowered the canvas bundles in. Hartwell gripped his notebook so tightly his knuckles ached. He wanted to run down there, to shout, to stop whatever was happening, but his reason held him in place. Without proof, without photographs, his accusations would be nothing but wild claims. They worked quickly to cover the pit, pressing the dirt down firmly. Then came something that turned Hartwell's stomach. 2 of the men brought out large sacks from under their coats and poured their contents over the newly filled grave. Even from a distance, Hartwell could see the pale, powdery clouds drifting up, lime, just as Sarah Kellerman had said. The group stood there for a moment, as if ensuring their work was done, then turned and made their way back to the house, leaving the earth smooth and unmarked. Hartwell stayed in the grove until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally broke the horizon, he packed his equipment and made his way toward the burial site. Every step felt heavier than the last. The ground was still fresh, the soil slightly sunken. Kneeling, Hartwell sifted a handful of dirt through his fingers. The lime burned faintly against his skin, a dry chemical heat that left his fingertips raw. He knew what it meant. The lime wasn't for gardening, it was to destroy what lay beneath. For the first time since beginning his investigation, Hartwell felt real fear. Not suspicion, not unease. Fear. That night he returned to the county seat and secured a room at the inn, locking the door behind him and drawing the curtains. He spent hours developing the photographs he had taken from the grove. The results were grainy, shadows swallowing much of the detail, but the images told a clear enough story. Figures digging, shapes lowered into the ground, the unmistakable gesture of pouring powder. He stared at the photographs long into the night, replaying the scene in his mind. The bundles had been small enough to be children, too small to be grown adults. The thought lodged in his throat like a stone. Hartwell considered going to Sheriff Tully immediately, but doubt gnawed at him. The Grimsbys had influence, quiet, subtle, but powerful. A single misstep, and the whole thing could be buried, just like those canvas bundles. He needed undeniable proof. The next day, Hartwell visited Drive. Marcus Tilton again, this time showing him the photographs. Tilton's face darkened as he studied them. "I've seen this before," the doctor said grimly. "Not here. In the war, lime is used to hasten decay, to prevent disease from spreading from the dead. But here, in a children's home." Tilton paused, then leaned closer. "If you're going to act, you must do it soon. Lime works quickly. In a week, there'll be nothing left to find." That night, Hartwell made his decision. He would not go to the sheriff, not yet. Instead, he would return to the Grimsby property and exhume what he had seen buried. If he could retrieve even the smallest fragment of evidence, cloth, bone, anything, he would have the means to force an investigation. The sky that evening was heavy with clouds, the air damp and cold. Hartwell carried only what he needed: a lantern, a small spade, his camera. The walk to the grove seemed longer than before, the trees whispering in the wind like they were trying to warn him. When he reached the burial site, he hesitated, listening. No sound from the house. No lanterns moving along the paths. He began to dig. At first, the soil came away easily, but the deeper he went, the more the lime burned at his skin. His breath grew ragged, his hands raw and blistered. Then, after what felt like hours, the spade struck something soft but resistant. He cleared the dirt with trembling hands. Canvas. His heart pounded as he pulled the fabric back. The stench hit him first, sweet, foul, unmistakable. Beneath the canvas was the curled form of a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, skin pale and marred by patches of lime burns. The eyes were closed, but the mouth was open in a silent scream. Hartwell staggered back, choking, his mind reeling. He forced himself to take photographs, each flash of light searing the image into his memory as much as onto the plate. He had his proof now, but also a target on his back. Somewhere in the stillness of the night, he thought he heard movement from the house. A door creaking, footsteps crunching, on gravel. Hartwell doused his lantern, the darkness swallowing him whole. If you want, I can now prepare part 7 where Hartwell's discovery puts him in direct danger, with the Grimsbys possibly becoming aware of his presence. That's where the tension will spike sharply. Part 7 The Whisper Beneath the Floorboards. The morning after Hartwell's terrifying encounter in the cellar, a pale winter sun barely touched the frost-covered fields surrounding the Grimsby property. He had not slept. Every time his eyes closed, he saw the outline of those small skeletal forms in the darkness, their hollow eyes following him even in dreams. His mind told him to leave, to abandon this cursed investigation, but his conscience insisted otherwise. The truth had its hooks in him now, pulling him deeper, no matter the cost. Hartwell spent the day in the tiny rented room above Kellerman's general store, hunched over a battered desk, his fingers ink-stained as he tried to commit his findings to paper. He documented everything: names, dates, witness statements, and the horrifying scene he had discovered in the cellar. But he knew his written words alone would not be enough to break through the wall of secrecy surrounding the Grimsby home. He needed irrefutable proof, photographs, artifacts, something that could not be dismissed as hearsay or an overactive imagination. By late afternoon, a biting wind swept in from the north, rattling the windows of his room. Hartwell decided he would return to the orphanage that very night. The moon would be waning, providing just enough light to work by without exposing his position. His plan was simple but dangerous. Slip inside, photograph the cellar, and search for any other evidence the Grimsbys had hidden away. He set out just after midnight, dressed in dark wool, his camera strapped tightly in its satchel, a lantern wrapped in cloth to dull its glow. The path to the orphanage was silent, the snow crunching under his boots sounding impossibly loud in the still air. When he reached the tree line near the property, Hartwell crouched low, scanning for movement. The main building stood black and still against the star-pricked sky. No lanterns burned within, no sound of wind whistling through open shutters, no creak of a swinging sign, just silence, heavy and unnatural. He moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows, and soon found himself at the same basement window through which he had first peered days earlier. With careful effort, he pried it open. The air inside was colder than the winter night, and it carried a faint, unmistakable odor of decay. He lowered himself quietly into the cellar, his boots touching down on hard-packed earth. This time, he did not fumble for the lantern immediately. Instead, he let his eyes adjust to the blackness, listening. That's when he heard it. A faint sound, so soft he almost dismissed it, like the rustle of fabric or a small sigh. It seemed to come from directly beneath his feet. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he unwrapped the lantern, letting its dim glow spill across the cellar. The skeletal remains he had seen before were still there, undisturbed. But in the far corner, Partially concealed by an overturned wooden crate, was something he hadn't noticed, a narrow trapdoor, its edges rimmed with frost. Hartwell approached cautiously, every nerve screaming at him to turn back. He set the lantern down, brushed away the frost, and found the old iron ring set into the wood. With a steady breath, he pulled. The hinges groaned softly, and a puff of air, warmer than the cellar's, brushed against his face. From the darkness below came the sound again. Not sighs, not whined, whispers. The voice, or voices, were too faint to understand, but their tone was urgent, almost pleading. Hartwell's skin prickled. He fumbled for his camera, then paused. If there were survivors down there, he couldn't waste time adjusting plates and chemicals. Lowering himself through the narrow opening, he found a crude wooden ladder descending into pitch-black space. The lantern's light revealed a low earthen tunnel, just high enough to crouch in. The air was damp, and the walls glistened with moisture. Somewhere ahead, the whispers ceased, replaced by a faint, rhythmic tapping. Hartwell followed the sound, his heart hammering. The tunnel branched twice. He chose the path where the air felt warmer. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and he stumbled forward into a small chamber. The sight froze him in place. Against the far wall sat 3 children, thin, pale, and motionless except for their wide, terrified eyes. Their wrists and ankles were bound with rough rope, and their faces were streaked with dirt and tears. One, a girl no older than 10, raised her head and whispered, "Please, take us away." Hartwell's throat tightened. He set the lantern down, kneeling to untie them. "I'm here to help," he whispered, his hands working quickly at the knots. But before he could free the second child, a deep voice echoed through the tunnel. "Step away from them." Hartwell spun, his lantern casting long, jagged shadows. In the tunnel entrance stood Mr. Grimsby, his massive frame blocking the way out, a long-handled shovel gripped in his hands. Behind him, the faint glow of another lantern revealed Mrs. Grimsby's pale, expressionless face. "You shouldn't have come back," she said softly, her tone almost mournful. "We gave you a chance to leave this alone." Hartwell rose slowly, putting himself between the children and their captors. "These children are coming with me. Whatever you've been doing here, it ends tonight." Grimsby's lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "You think you understand, but you don't. This is mercy. We spare them worse fates." "Mercy?" Hartwell spat. "You've buried children in your cellar. You've lied to the state, to the townsfolk." Mrs. Grimsby stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the chamber. "The world is cruel, Mr. Hartwell. Some debts can only be paid in flesh. The children are part of the bargain." Before Hartwell could demand an explanation, Grimsby lunged. Hartwell barely dodged the swing of the shovel, the iron scraping against the earthen wall. In the chaos, Hartwell grabbed the lantern and smashed it against the tunnel floor. Flames leapt up instantly, licking the dry wooden supports. The Grimsbys shouted, whether in rage or fear, Hartwell couldn't tell, but he used the moment to grab the nearest child and push toward the ladder. The other 2 scrambled behind him, their bare feet slapping against the packed dirt. Smoke began to fill the tunnel, thick and choking. Hartwell emerged into the cellar, gasping for air, and hauled the children up through the window one by one. The cold night air hit him like a blessing. But when he turned for a final look, the trapdoor was already engulfed in flames, and the voices of the Grimsbys were lost in the roar of fire. By the time Hartwell reached the safety of the tree line with the children, the main building was alight, flames devouring the roof. He stood there shivering, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that whatever bargain the Grimsbys had made, it had been interrupted, and not destroyed. Because somewhere beneath the crackle of the burning orphanage, Hartwell thought he heard it again, whispers, rising from the earth. Dash dash dash. If you want, I can now prepare part 8 so the horror arc moves toward its climax. That's where the mystery of the bargain can be fully revealed and tied to something far older than the Grimsbys themselves. Part 8. The Chamber Beneath. Hartwell descended the narrow stairwell, the flickering lamplight casting warped shadows along the damp stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the smell of earth and something metallic, something he instinctively recognized but didn't want to name. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, their creaks muffled by the dense silence. At the base, the passage widened into a corridor lined with wooden doors, each reinforced with rusted iron bands. The wood was aged, scarred with scratches, gouges, as if something had desperately tried to escape. Hartwell raised his lantern, its light dancing over crude carvings etched into the doors, symbols he didn't understand, jagged lines, and words in trembling script. One door caught his attention immediately. The message carved there was in the same faint, uneven hand he had seen under the dining hall table: "Help us." His breath caught. He reached for the iron latch, but it resisted. Locked. Every door in the corridor was the same, secure, immovable, the locks thick with neglect but still intact. Hartwell took a step back, scanning for another way forward, when a faint sound reached him. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so soft he might have mistaken it for the shifting of the old timbers. But then it came again, a muffled sob. He froze, straining to hear. It was coming from somewhere ahead, the sound of a child's voice, faint and wavering, as if carried from a great distance. He followed it, heart pounding, until the corridor ended in an arched doorway. Beyond it lay a wider chamber, its low ceiling supported by thick beams darkened with age. Hartwell stepped inside and stopped dead. The room was lined with shelves, rows upon rows of small wooden boxes, each marked with a number burned into the lid. The boxes were arranged with meticulous care, stacked high against the walls, their uniformity chilling in its precision. In the center of the room stood a large wooden table, stained dark in places where the grain seemed swollen and warped. But it wasn't the table or the boxes that rooted him to the spot, it was what lay scattered at the table's base. Tiny shoes. Dozens of them. He dropped to one knee, picking up a scuffed leather boot no longer than his hand. It was still laced, its stitching frayed from wear. He set it down and picked up another, a small black slipper with a torn strap. Every pair was different, but all were child-sized, worn, and abandoned. The sobbing came again, louder now. Hartwell's head snapped toward the far corner, where a narrow opening led into darkness. Without thinking, he moved toward it, the lantern held high. The passage beyond was smaller, forcing him to hunch. The floor was slick with moisture, the walls weeping cold water. The sobbing had stopped, replaced by a faint rustling. Hartwell rounded a bend and entered another chamber, and instantly wished he hadn't. This room was not empty. Against the far wall, a row of wooden cots stood, each occupied. At first, Hartwell thought the children lying there were asleep. But as he drew closer, his stomach twisted. The bodies were motionless, their skin as pale as candle wax, their eyes closed not in rest, but in something far more final. He staggered backward, his lantern shaking in his grip. Every cot was the same, small, pitiful forms lying still beneath thin blankets. A sound broke the silence. From the shadows near the ceiling, something shifted. Hartwell turned sharply, raising the light. At first, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, a shape emerged, a child, impossibly thin, clinging to the beams above. The face was hollow-cheeked, the eyes wide and unblinking. Dirt streaked the child's skin, and their hair hung in matted ropes. The moment Hartwell's light fell on them. The child dropped soundlessly to the ground and darted toward the far wall. Hartwell called out, "Wait! I'm here to help," but the child vanished through a gap in the stones that looked far too small for a human body. Hartwell lunged forward, peering into the opening. Beyond it, the passage dropped into absolute darkness, the air rushing up from below cold and fetid. He couldn't follow, not without crawling into the earth itself. The realization struck him with sickening clarity: this was no ordinary cellar. It was a labyrinth, a network of hidden chambers and passages beneath the orphanage, designed to keep whatever happened here away from prying eyes. He turned to leave, but a sound stopped him, the soft scrape of footsteps behind him. He spun around. In the doorway stood Mrs. Grimsby. She was holding no lantern, yet her eyes caught the light in a way that made Hartwell's skin crawl. She said nothing at first, only looked at him, her gaze sliding over the shoes, the cots, the still forms beneath their blankets. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Hartwell," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with something cold. Hartwell's hand tightened around the lantern handle. "Where are the children?" Mrs. Grimsby's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something that might have been one in a different world. "They are where they belong." Hartwell took a step forward. "I've seen enough to bring the sheriff here before dawn." Her eyes flickered, amusement, not fear. "You think the sheriff doesn't know?" The words hit him like a blow. Mrs. Grimsby stepped closer, the darkness around her seeming to thicken. "You see, Mr. Hartwell, people prefer not to look too closely at certain arrangements. It keeps their lives tidy." Hartwell's mind raced, weighing his chances. He was unarmed, deep underground, and facing a woman who clearly had no intention of letting him leave. "You'll forgive me," she continued, "but I can't have you wandering where you don't belong." Before he could react, she raised her hand, and something heavy moved in the shadows, a figure, broad-shouldered and silent, stepping forward from the darkness. Hartwell recognized him at once. The same man who had carried supplies from town, his face expressionless, his eyes as empty as the cots behind him. Hartwell backed toward the passage he had entered from, his lantern's light jittering across the walls. But even as he moved, the man advanced, each step measured, inevitable. The cold realization settled over him like a shroud: he was trapped. If you want, I can immediately continue with Part 9, where Hartwell attempts his desperate escape from the underground chambers and the truth of the Grimsby home begins to fully reveal itself. Part 9: The tunnels beneath Grimsby. The wind that night howled through the bare trees like the cries of lost children. Hartwell stood at the edge of the orchard, staring toward the dark silhouette of the Grimsby home. He had returned under the cover of midnight, determined to find answers. The sheriff's refusal to investigate further had only strengthened his resolve. If the law would not act, then he would. This time, he carried more than just his camera. In his satchel were a small lantern, extra oil, a length of rope, and his Colt Navy revolver. Every creak of the frost-hardened ground seemed to announce his presence, but the house loomed still and silent, no lanterns glowing within. He slipped around to the rear of the building where he had once glimpsed the sealed root cellar. The lock was still there, heavy and rusted, but its hasp had been recently oiled, a detail Hartwell had not noticed before. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a narrow steel pick, a gift from an old locksmith friend. It took several tense minutes, but the lock yielded with a quiet click. The heavy wooden door groaned as he pulled it open. The smell that hit him was not the earthy dampness of vegetables in storage, it was something colder, fouler, metallic. Hartwell set the lantern on the ground, its faint glow spilling into the darkness. The stairs descended farther than he expected, the stone walls narrowing until he had to duck beneath the low ceiling. He could hear faint dripping somewhere below, like water echoing in a cavern. The air was thick and unmoving. Halfway down, he paused. A low, muffled sound, almost like the rustle of cloth, came from the darkness ahead. Hartwell's hand went to his revolver, thumb easing the hammer back. The stairs ended in a corridor of roughly cut stone, lit faintly by his lantern's glow. Along one wall, heavy wooden doors stood at intervals, each bound with iron straps. He stepped closer to the nearest, running his hand over the scarred surface. His fingers found deep gouges, scratches, running in jagged lines, as if made by fingernails. From behind another door came a faint whimper. Hartwell's pulse pounded in his ears. He knelt, pressing his ear against the wood. A small, trembling voice spoke from within. "Is someone there?" The words were so faint he thought at first he'd imagined them. Swallowing hard, Hartwell whispered back, "Yes, I'm here. Who are you?" A pause. Then, "My name is Mary. How long have you been here?" he asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Since the winter snows. But, the others, they've been here longer." Hartwell's breath caught. "Others? How many?" The girl's voice trembled. "I don't know. Some, they take away and never come back." A chill ran down Hartwell's spine. He tested the iron latch but it held firm. The hinges were massive, bolted deep into the stone. He would need more than a pick to open them. He forced himself onward, deeper into the corridor. The dripping sound grew louder, until he emerged into a large chamber beneath the main house. In the center stood a table. No, not a table, a slab of stone, stained dark in ways Hartwell didn't want to consider. Chains hung from the walls, and along one side of the room were several barrels marked with symbols he didn't recognize. At the far end of the chamber, the corridor continued, sloping downward. A cold draft wafted up from below. Hartwell followed it cautiously, every step echoing in the confined space. After perhaps 50 yards, the stone passage gave way to earth, reinforced with beams like a mine shaft. The air grew colder still. His lantern light flickered across strange markings carved into the timbers, spirals, crude figures, and symbols resembling eyes. The tunnel ended abruptly at a heavy wooden gate reinforced with iron. Beyond, Hartwell thought he saw movement, a shadow shifting just out of reach of the lantern's light. He stepped closer, raising the lamp. The shadow retreated, but not before he caught a glimpse of something pale. Not cloth, skin. A sudden noise behind him made him whirl, lantern swinging wildly. Footsteps, fast, purposeful, coming down the tunnel. Hartwell snuffed the lantern, plunging himself into darkness. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. A voice, smooth and calm, spoke from the blackness. "Mr. Hartwell," it said, "you should not be here." Hartwell recognized the tone immediately. It was Jonathan Grimsby himself. "I've seen enough," Hartwell said, his revolver steady in his hand. "You're keeping those children down here. God help you for what you're doing." Grimsby's laugh was low and humorless. "God has nothing to do with it." There was movement again, a metallic scrape, the unmistakable sound of a door closing somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Hartwell realized, with a sinking feeling, that Grimsby had cut off his retreat. "Leave your camera on the ground and walk toward me," Grimsby instructed. "You will not be harmed, if you do as I say." Hartwell's mind raced. In the darkness, the tunnels felt like a maze, each direction a trap. He had one chance, to reach the girl Mary and the others before Grimsby could stop him. Without answering, he swung the lantern hard against the tunnel wall, shattering the glass. The sudden flare of oil ignited in a burst of light, momentarily blinding both men. Hartwell ran toward the corridor where he had heard Mary's voice, the revolver still in his grip. Shouts echoed behind him, more than one voice now. Boots pounded against stone. Hartwell skidded to a stop at the cell door and fired a shot into the iron latch. The report thundered in the confined space, and the lock shattered. The door swung inward to reveal a girl no older than 12, her face pale and hollow-eyed. Behind her, in the shadows, Hartwell saw the outlines of at least 4 other children. "Come with me, quickly," he urged. But as Mary stepped forward, the sound of running feet grew louder. Lantern light spilled into the corridor from behind. Hartwell turned, gun raised, and froze. The men advancing toward him were not just Grimsby and his brothers, but several others, their faces covered in strange masks carved from wood, each one painted with staring eyes. Grimsby's voice rang out over the chaos. "Take them all. We'll deal with Mr. Hartwell later." Before Hartwell could fire, something heavy slammed into the back of his head. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Mary's terrified face disappearing into the sea of masked figures. If you'd like, I can continue immediately with Part 10, the final confrontation and resolution. This one will push all the tension from this scene into the climax. Part 10, the last room. The storm raged harder than ever, rattling the windows of the Kellerman Estate like a giant trying to get in. Water seeped under the warped wooden frames, puddling on the cracked floorboards. Every flicker of lightning lit up the faces of those who remained, pale, hollow-eyed, and clinging to the scraps of courage they had left. The group had been reduced to 3. Amelia, whose hands trembled even when she clenched them into fists, David, his once calm voice now a cracked whisper, and Evelyn, her hair matted with sweat, her eyes sharp with something between fear and determination. They had been through 9 rooms. 9 horrors, each worse than the last. And now, they stood before the 10th door, the one that had been locked from the very beginning. "It's the last one," David said, his voice breaking. "We go in, we finish this. Or, we don't come out at all." Lightning flashed. In that brief moment of light, Amelia saw something on the wood, faint carvings, almost hidden by the grain. She leaned closer. They weren't random scratches. They were words. "It watches you too." Before she could speak, Evelyn pressed the key, the final one they'd found, hidden in the cold hands of the body in room 9, into the rusted lock. It turned with a groan. The door creaked open. Inside was darkness. Not the kind that came from the absence of light, but a thick, breathing kind, as though it was alive. They stepped in. The door slammed shut behind them. At first, there was only silence. Then, the whispers began. They weren't coming from one direction, they came from everywhere at once. The ceiling, the floor, inside their own skulls. "You've come so far. We've been waiting. You are ours now." David clutched his head, dropping to his knees. "It's inside my mind," he screamed. Amelia's breathing quickened. She felt hands, cold, invisible, brush against her arms. Then, a shape began to form in front of them. It didn't step out of the dark. It was the dark. A towering figure, faceless yet somehow smiling. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice shaking but loud. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head like a curious animal. Its voice was not one, but hundreds layered together. "We want what you brought with you." "What?" Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Your fear." The room shifted. The walls bled black liquid. The ceiling lowered like the lid of a coffin. David's scream cut through the air as shadowy arms erupted from the floor, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him down. "No." Amelia lunged for him, but her hands passed through the shadows as if they were smoke. David was swallowed whole. The floor closed over him as if he had never been there. Amelia's sobs echoed. Evelyn grabbed her arm. "We have to end this. Now." "But how?" Evelyn's eyes darted to the far corner of the room, the only place where the darkness seemed weaker, where the shape of a rotting wooden chest could be seen. They ran to it. Inside the chest was something strange, a mirror, cracked and dirty. But unlike a normal mirror, it didn't reflect them. It reflected the figure, and in the reflection, the figure wasn't untouchable. It was screaming. Evelyn's eyes widened. This is it. This is how we fight it. She lifted the mirror, turning it toward the creature. The moment its own image was revealed, the room trembled violently. The whispers turned into wails. The shadows recoiled. The faceless thing thrashed, clawing at the air as if it could tear its own reflection away. But the mirror began to crack further. "Hold it steady," Amelia shouted. "I'm trying." Evelyn gritted her teeth. The final crack splintered through the glass. The mirror exploded in a flash of blinding light. The creature let out one final, deafening shriek, and then, silence. When the light faded, the room was empty. No doors. No shadows. Just Amelia and Evelyn, standing on cold stone. And then, they woke up. Dash dash dash. Amelia gasped, sitting upright. She was in her own bed. Morning light streamed through her window. It was over. Or was it? On her nightstand lay the mirror. Still cracked. And in the reflection, something moved. Dash dash dash. Loudspeaker. If you enjoyed this horror series, don't just read, be part of the nightmare. Skull. Subscribe for more chilling tales. Ghost. Share this story with your bravest friends. Candle. Comment below. Would you have stepped into the final room?